My name is Dr. Matthew Wildcat. I'm an assistant professor of political science and Native studies at the University of Alberta, and I'm also a research fellow with the Wildcat Law and Governance Lodge. What I want to talk about today is Indigenous sovereignty, or what I often call Indigenous sovereignties, and the various theorizations, conceptualizations, and ways in which the field of Indigenous studies treats Indigenous sovereignty. The main point that I want to get across today is that within the field of Indigenous sovereignty, to properly understand it, you need to operate between the space of what is and what is possible. What I sometimes call this in-between space as well. And that one can only understand Indigenous sovereignty properly if you operate between this space of what exists on the ground right now in regard to Indigenous sovereignty, but then also what is possible in the future. What can we move and what can we get to? This main argument was developed for an introduction that I'm currently writing with my co-author, Justin DeLeon, for a special issue on creative sovereignties. This special issue on creative sovereignties does focus primarily on Indigenous sovereignty. And we wanted to do a literature study of how Indigenous sovereignties are currently written and talked about. And this in-between space, it was really apparent that it was a key part of the literature. So we looked at it from two different angles, and the angles ended up coming together in quite a fascinating way. So the first thing we were interested in was this tendency in Indigenous studies literature to attach descriptors, qualifiers, and other terms to Indigenous sovereignty. And actually in the last 15 years, there's been at least 14 academic books where people modify or change sovereignty in some sort of way. So we have terms like visual sovereignty, nested sovereignty, the sovereignty of the soul. These are and all 14 of these books have different ways in which they speak about sovereignty in this manner. When we began to realize this trend and this phenomenon, what we think all of these authors do in different ways is that they work in this in-between space, this space between what sovereignty is on the ground and what sovereignty possibly could be. I think this is also really interesting because sovereignty is not a concept which is unique to Indigenous studies. In fact, sovereignty is a concept which is core to many disciplines: political science, law, anthropology, sociology. All of these fields deal with sovereignty, but none of them treat sovereignty in the way in which Indigenous studies does, where you always attach modifiers or descriptors to the term sovereignty rather than just use the term sovereignty on its own. In our work on creative sovereignties, we took up creativity in three ways as well. So one, creativity as thinking conceptually, so thinking outside of the box, creativity as a practice or a means, and then finally creativity as to bring something into being, to create. And these three things can match up with mind, body, and spirit, if you like, as well. So mind, the ability to think creatively outside of the box. Body, the ability to use your body to practice to undertake artistic and creative practices. And then spiritually, in the sense of bringing something into being, to create. And in fact, we wanted to talk in some way about spirituality within our research process. We took inspiration from Marissa Durete's 2017 book, Network Sovereignty. She gives the following quote to talk about creation as something that you bring into being. I had stumbled across a book by Mexican-American philosopher Manuel de Landa, in which he describes institutions as crystallizations of human ways of communicating with one another within dynamic, ever-changing environments. I most appreciate this idea for how it echoed native concepts of creation, in which all forms that come into existence are understood as outcomes of a cosmic dynamic, of which humans are a small part. To create is to bring into being. So I want to talk about some of the other works that we have involved in this, and the ways in which they move fluidly in this in-between space between what is and what is possible. And I want to suggest that this is actually a method within Indigenous studies, the ability to move back and forth in this in-between space. One of the reasons why I want to suggest that is because in social science research, we're often taught that there's a clear distinction between empirical research and normative research. So empirical, studying the way in which the world operates without bias or a level of objectivity, and normative research by saying what the world should be, How can we achieve a just and a fair and equal world? And I think what we see in these studies is with Indigenous studies of Indigenous sovereignty, that people must do both all the time and must move quite fluidly back and forth between the two. Let's start with Audra Simpson and her concept of nested sovereignty discussed within her 2014 book, Mohawk Interruptus. She says that one sovereign political body can be nested within another. And this, of course, upends our notion of sovereignty because we typically think of sovereignty as being a supreme authority within a defined territory. She says, like Indigenous bodies, Indigenous sovereignties and political orders prevail within and apart from settler governance. So, at first glance, one might think this is a normative attempt, an attempt of Simpson to elevate the status of Indigenous sovereignty, to make it clear that Indigenous sovereignties interrupt or persist within settler sovereignties. But when you read her book, I think it's really clear that that's not the case, that she is not trying to make a normative claim. She's in fact making an empirical claim that Indigenous sovereignties continue to persist regardless of the way in which settler states like Canada and the US have overrun Indigenous sovereignties in the present. She documents very, very well how these two sovereignties exist in enormous tension with each other, that they run into each other and that they conflict, and that the enormous tension produced out of these interactions is what shows us that nested sovereignties is actually an empirical concept rather than a normative concept. That's not to mean that there's not a normative component to her work. Of course, she wants to see Mohawk sovereignties in particular, but Indigenous sovereignties also, that the injustice of the ways in which they've been curtailed and stamped out and confined within settler states is something that we need to address. This practice or this tradition, one might say, of attaching descriptors or qualifiers or modifiers to the concept of sovereignty within Indigenous studies goes back to at least 1994 with Robert Warrior and his work on intellectual sovereignty, part of a longer tradition of Indigenous literary studies within Indigenous studies. For Robert Warrior, the process of sovereignty provides a way of envisioning intellectual work we as Indigenous peoples do. Warrior suggests that intellectual sovereignty should be a practice that encourages the engagement of a myriad of critical issues to Indigenous future. So in these 14 texts we identified, there's at least 3 buckets that they fall into when dealing with sovereignty. So the first bucket is the ways in which colonial sovereignty or settler sovereignty impinges Indigenous peoples. And so we see people using those terms. So for instance, Lisa Ford in her book, Settler Sovereignty, looks at how do we track the rise of settler sovereignty in settler states like Australia and the United States. For her, that process occurs, or settler sovereignty crystallizes, when settler states start to criminalize violence within Indigenous communities. So for her, settler states are often, in the early going, willing to let Indigenous people's legal forms persist to maintain, but eventually, crime that occurs within Indigenous communities, settler states are no longer willing to let Indigenous peoples use their own political orders to settle those disputes, and instead come in, criminalize Indigenous peoples within their own interactions with each other. In the second bucket, we have a number of studies that look at how settler and Indigenous sovereignties constrain each other. Of course, they do it to much different effect. Settler sovereignties have a much greater effect to constrain the way in which Indigenous sovereignties can operate. But nonetheless, Indigenous sovereignties also reach out and constrain settler sovereignties in different ways as well. So for instance, Kevin Bernil, with his third space of sovereignty, says that Indigenous sovereignties exist neither wholly inside nor wholly outside of US sovereignty, but rather it straddles a third space in between. This, I think, is an important work because it says while Indigenous peoples have an international character, that their sovereignties supersede American sovereignties in some ways, in other ways, Indigenous sovereignties are contained within the American state. Again, moving fluidly back and forth between this space of what is and what is possible. Another really interesting text in this second bucket is Jessica Catalino and her work on gambling within the Seminole tribes in Florida. She comes up with the term, the double bind of sovereignty. And it's used to describe how Indigenous nations require resources to exercise sovereignty. However, once they exercise this economic power, the legitimacy of Indigenous sovereignty and citizenship is challenged within settler societies. So on the one hand, Indigenous societies need money in order to exercise their sovereignty, but when Indigenous peoples gain wealth, their sovereignty is undermined or by representations that settler society has of Indigenous peoples as backwards, primitive, as something that exists in the past. And so as Indigenous peoples enter modernity and attempt to exercise their sovereignties in the present, they are also undercut by the way in which settler society views Indigenous peoples. Hence, the double bind of sovereignty. Once you have more of it, it's undercut by settler society. This is also really similar to Kealani Kawanui and her recent book. For her, settler colonization creates a lose-lose situation for Indigenous peoples who are seeking to pursue their sovereignty. Rather than focus on cultural difference, Kawanui provides a vivid portrait of how Hawaiian elites in the 19th century reconfigured Hawaiian political orders to receive recognition from European states. Here, Hawaiians paid particular attention to ensure that their legal orders reflected European norms as much as possible, in particular around sexuality and gender. For Kawanui, and I'm quoting here, the move to independence for the nation requires the subordination of women and the oppressive revision of sexual customs, at least in the current judicial straitjacket, which enabled Hawaiians to be seen as modern subjects in the first place. Moving to a northern context in Canada and also an entire century and a half later, Paul Nadazdi's recent work is called Sovereignties Entailments, First Nation State Formation in the Yukon. Here, Nadazdi is concerned not just with sovereignty, but also with its entailments: territory, citizenship, the nation, and time. Nadazdi draws his observations from being asked to work for and sometimes represent Kluane First Nation within their self-government processes. Nadazdi argues that within these processes, Indigenous governments have far more pressure on them to conform to Western precepts of sovereignty in order to be recognized by the Canadian state than Indigenous peoples have to mold the process to reflect Indigenous norms and philosophies and governing values. So for Nadazdi, sovereignty acts as a precondition for politics. He says, any effort by Indigenous peoples to engage with settler state officials in the political arena requires them to conform to the cultural entailments of sovereignty, a set of assumptions about nature, space, time, knowledge, and sociology, all intimately bound up with the state form, or not risk being heard at all. So for Nadazdi, even as Indigenous peoples undertake these efforts to achieve sovereignty, the way in which the settler state is able to shape the conditions under which that take place is far more powerful than Indigenous people's ability to mold those conditions themselves. All of these works, again, are moving, I think, fluidly between describing what is possible, trying to open up the possibilities of what a just relationship would look like, what Indigenous nations could achieve from a sovereign perspective, while also at the same time laying out the bare, hard, cold facts of what sovereignty looks like in the present. And the third and final bucket, Indigenous scholars tend to turn towards the question of what should Indigenous sovereignties look like? And they come up with a number of terms. So for example, Michelle Raheja's work on visual sovereignty looks at how Indigenous peoples use artistic and representational practices as forms of sovereignty. I want to look at this book by Deer, who looks at sexual violence against Indigenous women and her concept, the sovereignty of the soul. Deer outlines how sexual violence is embedded in colonizing and genocidal practices, and that work to achieve sovereignty must include stronger responses to rape and self-determination for survivors of sexual violence within Indigenous nations. For Deer, self-determination for individual survivors and self-determination for tribal nations are closely connected. And she asserts, and again I'm quoting here, that it's impossible to have truly self-determining nations when its members have been denied self-determination over their own bodies. Thus, sovereignty of the soul is a call to pay attention to the traumatic impacts of violence on individuals and calls on nations who are hoping to achieve sovereignty that they must both prevent but also heal trauma in order to achieve, for individuals, in order to achieve sovereignty at a collective level. So we came at this in-between space primarily from thinking about the ways in which Indigenous studies modifies and attaches different terms to the concept of sovereignty. But when we talked about creative sovereignties, we also wanted to think about how do we do this work outside of merely writing about it on the paper? How do we do this work in other ways? So for instance, in our special issue, we will have poetry and music involved. But I also wanted to think about it in terms of how do we take ourselves out of our comfort zone and get in front of the camera, go and talk about our work rather than simply writing it down, and how all of those practices, these creative practices that we have to undertake, how this is also part of the in-between space of Indigenous sovereignty, of creating ways in which we not only document what is happening, but also find ways in order to further our sovereignties and strengthen our sovereignties into the future.